Once there was a seminary professor who was traveling to the West Coast, and he needed the time on that long flight to prepare and study, so he buckled down and let everyone near him feel the tension. Don't bother me. I'm a busy man with places to go and work to do. A young woman and a baby slipped into the two seats next to him, and he thought, this will be difficult, so he maintained a straight face and, in his words, looked very Presbyterian. It lasted for about 6 minutes. Pretty soon, the little boy began fussing around. Man, he cooed at him, and he couldn't resist, so he put his sermon back in his briefcase, picked him up out of his seat, and just loved him all the way across the country. And when they landed in Los Angeles, his mother said to him, "Thank you for doing that. He lost his father not long ago, and he is no man to muss him up like that and love him. Thank you so very, very much." And Dr. Kirkland said that as he got off the plane and pushed into the crowd that's LAX, he realized just how much joy that little boy brought into his own heart when he least expected it. Sometimes a child will do that for us. Sometimes a child can get into a heart that has been locked tight for years. And isn't that really what Christmas is all about? There's a child that has brought that kind of joy into multiplied millions of hearts. And that's the joy that we celebrate on this fourth Sunday of Advent. You heard the story from the Gospel of Matthew. Joseph was engaged to a young woman from Nazareth named Mary. Historically and culturally, we can almost assume that they had been engaged from childhood. So we don't really know how long they had been engaged, but we do know that they had entered into the last stage of their engagement, which was known as the betrothal. And betrothal is much more serious than our engagement. It lasted about a year and was a legally binding contract which could only be broken by death or divorce. So I am sure that the couple was doing all the things that couples do to get ready for weddings. You know, the bride is rushing hither, thither, and yon, and she keeps asking the groom, "So what do you think, honey? Is this right? Should we do that? Well, what about the flowers and the reception?" And Joseph, being the good groom, is nodding and smiling and saying, "Whatever you think, dear." And I don't know exactly how she broke the news to him, but at some point in all of the wedding arrangements, she must have done "I'm so excited about this," and what with Rachel coming for the wedding and Martha and Elizabeth. Did I tell you that Elizabeth is pregnant? Well, I did. That is such a neat thing. You know, I'm pregnant too. Maybe the boys will play together when they grow up. Do you think we ought to have fish at the reception as well as the beef? And Joseph does a, "Whoa, what did you say?" And Mary would respond and say, "Do you think we should have fish at the reception as well as beef?" "No, not that. The other part." "Oh, you mean about Rachel coming down? Didn't I tell you?" Seriously, I don't know how Mary did it. How do you tell your fiancé that you're pregnant and they had nothing to do with it? There's no Christmas story from Luke that she could read to him to explain how it all happened. But however she did it, it must have left him completely stunned. How could she possibly have betrayed him and then expected him to believe that entire line about her still being a virgin and the Father being the Holy Spirit? Right. So I'm guessing the conversation had to end with Joseph feeling betrayed and Mary feeling hurt because he didn't believe her and doubted her integrity. But what could he do? He had trusted her. He had wanted to spend the rest of his life with her, but for her to go and, Well, it just wasn't right. So what was he to do? Well, there were a couple of options. He could have had her stoned to death. According to the law, that was the punishment for adultery, and during the betrothal period, it would have been considered adultery. The other option, of course, was to simply break off the engagement, but remember, by this time, it could only be done with a formal divorce. The Bible tells us that Joseph was a just man, and so he decided to go through a simple, quiet divorce so that Mary would not be disgraced publicly and get on with his life. But life is never that simple, is it? That night, as he tumbled into what must have been a troubled sleep, something pretty remarkable happened. An angel appeared to Joseph, and everything changed. And we remember those wonderful words, beginning with, "Do not be afraid," right? Joseph, son of David, don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife, because the child she carries was conceived by the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you will call him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. And then Matthew continues, now all of this took place so that what the Lord had spoken through the prophet Isaiah had been fulfilled. Look, a virgin will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, and Emmanuel means God with us. So hold on. Let's pause for just a moment. The promise of Jesus' birth and Jesus' name is God with us. And that first person plural pronoun establishes how God in the flesh chooses to be in the world, reminding us of who we are meant to be and supposed to be, people in community with God, people oriented toward the other because of God, people who truly believe that God is present even when just two of us are gathered. Matthew's point is simply that Jesus came as one of us. Jesus was born like we are, lived as we live, loved and laughed and suffered as we do, and died as we will die. Of course, on the third day, God raised him from the dead that we might no longer live in fear of death, but that's getting ahead of our story. For now, we should just wait, content with Matthew's spare story. Compared to Luke, this one's really, really short, and it's sort of an odd version of the incarnation, because Matthew paints a picture of the utter normalcy of the incarnation and the Holy Family, which means, of course, that he tells about the complexity and the confusion and the frailty that attended this family, just like every other family. God comes through ordinary, mixed-up people in order to save ordinary, mixed-up people, and comes through a birth like all the millions of other births in the world to promise us freedom from sin and fear and death and rebirth as children of God. It's an odd story, to be sure, but one that expresses joy in the midst of hurt and betrayal, fulfillment even when everything doesn't happen the way it was expected to happen. In other words, God with us is both a promise and a possibility. It's both presence and potential. Because God with us means we're not alone. We're never apart from God, and we're never apart from each other or from the responsibility that we have for each other. And we don't have to be afraid because we have each other and we have God. You know, it's been said that the opposite of joy that derives from fear is worry. And worry is the illusion that we can somehow prevent tomorrow's heartache. Isn't that a great definition? Worry is the illusion that we can somehow prevent tomorrow's heartache. And when we live in worry, we live not in the present, but our minds keep tending towards some unknown future. And so we often miss the joy of what's occurring right now, and we miss opportunities to be fully present to others with all of our attention and our support. Because when we're robbed of our joy, it's really hard to create more joy out in the world. You may have heard of this wonderful story of the small church that each year put on a traditional nativity pageant. In that particular church, there was a lively 10-year-old boy who had managed to create disorder in every Christmas play he had ever been in. The boy's name was Barry, and one year, his angel wings caught on fire, which nearly burned the church down. The next year, he was Herod the Great, and he jumped up from his throne and in his usual clumsy way, jerked the carpet out from under the 3 wise men and dumped them on their heads. So the worried children and their parents, afraid of what might happen, begged the teacher not to let Barry ruin another play. Please, teacher, can't you leave Barry out this year? But the teacher could not reject a boy who tried his best and loved Jesus with all his heart, even if he was a little clumsy. So she was able to convince the children that Barry could not do any real damage by playing the innkeeper of Bethlehem. He just opened and closed the door and spoke one short line. And Barry made it perfectly through all the rehearsals and the dress rehearsal. And then on the night when mothers, fathers, friends, strangers, and the whole community sat in hushed silence, reliving the Christmas story, Barry had his chance to redeem himself with a flawless performance. He opened the door of the inn, and he looked straight into the face of Mary and Joseph. Mary sat very sad and pale on a little donkey, which had never been used in practice. You could almost hear the cold wind whistling around the cold stone walls of the inn and blowing the thin cloak of the gentle Mary. But Barry came through. He said his line with professional emphasis and timing, "Be gone! I have no room for you." Mary and Joseph turned sadly away into the cold night. But Barry was in the real spirit and meaning of the play. Those who were on the front row saw tears well up in his eyes, and his lips begin to tremble. "Wait!" The sound came like a thunderclap, and every heart in the room stopped. What on earth? That word was not in the script of the traditional Christmas story. So Barry finished it. "Wait, you can have my room." Well, bedlam broke loose. Children cried, parents were outraged, pandemonium reigned. Barry had ruined another Christmas play. But the discerning teacher quieted the crowd, dried Barry's tears as well as her own, and said, "Maybe Barry was the real messenger after all. Only to those who have room in their hearts can the dear Christ child enter in." You see, joy comes when we live in the moment and agree that God comes in unexpected places and speaks through unexpected people. Sometimes we can become so busy celebrating Christmas that we fail to hear the voice of the Word made flesh who spoke the first Christmas into existence. But there's one more thing that must be said, because you can't isolate the coming of the baby from the rest of God's activity in human history. Advent and Christmas are just a part of an unfolding drama, and for now we realize that the story of Christmas is not finished yet. Each of us will choose how to finish the story in our own lives, and that's precisely where we stand on this fourth Sunday of Advent. Will you shout with Barry, "Wait, you can have my room," which I believe is just another way of saying, "Wait, you can have all my heart and all my joy"? Or will you simply be observers who keep the Christ child in the manger, where you can visit him without fail just once every year? George Bernard Shaw wrote, "This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being thoroughly worn out before you're thrown on the scrap heap, and being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy." Yes, I believe there are angels among us, that God is making us ready to be messengers of joy, flying in the face of fear in an ever-changing world.